Across a continent-spanning empire, the sun glints off stone roads, bathhouses and marble temples. It flashes on shields and spears, on the bronze helmets of soldiers who have carried Rome's eagle from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germania. Everywhere the imperial insignia, the sign of the wolf and the eagle, marks the world as Rome's own. But if one follows the glint of metal beyond the marble and the order, beyond the laughter of senators and merchants, a darker truth emerges. Beneath the brilliance of this empire lies a foundation built not on freedom, but on flesh. They are the invisible millions, men, women and children owned like tools. Roman citizens walk tall because others walk bent behind them. The empire's peace, its wealth, its order, all rest on one thing: obedience bought by fear. The marketplace of flesh. In the heart of Rome, the forum hums with trade. To any visitor it glows with life, vendors shouting prices, donkeys braying, the smell of sweat and olive oil. But to one side, under an arch where shadow meets sunlight, merchandise of a different kind stands waiting. Iron collars glint on necks. Some bear tags that read, Severus, 22 years old, knows Greek. Others, Lydia, domestic, good cook, does not speak Latin. Tears streak dirt on faces that once knew freedom. Names have become prices. Lives have become investments. A senator in white toga inspects a young man's teeth as if examining a horse. The man does not look up. He knows his value, 2,000 sestertii. Behind them, an overseer raises a whip, not to strike, but to remind. The memory of pain has its own language in Rome. This is how the empire begins each day, through the buying and selling of human beings. Slavery isn't hidden here. It's a display of power. In Roman eyes it is normal, necessary, even sacred. Freedom for a few depends on chains for the many. The Romans' logic of power. Roman writers called their civilization the light of the world. But Rome's light was fed by the shadows it cast. Order through fear. That unwritten law ruled every corner of the empire. To govern vast lands filled with people who remembered their freedom, Rome relied not only on legions and walls, but on terror. Methodical, ritualized, and spectacular. In the provinces, crucifixions lined the roads. Thieves, rebels, runaway slaves, all turned into warnings nailed to wooden crosses. The empire needed no billboards. It had bodies. Roman law was clear. A slave had no personal rights. They could not marry, own property, or testify against a free citizen. A master could torture or kill a slave without punishment. If a slave murdered a master, all slaves in the household were executed, every single one, because Rome understood what it feared most: unity among the enslaved. The household prison. In an elegant villa on the outskirts of Capua, the scent of roasted meat drifts from a kitchen built underneath the main house. Dozens work there in silence, some grinding grain, some scrubbing floors, some nursing burns from spilled oil. Above them, music and laughter echo through marble halls. Among the servants moves a girl named Tullia. Born into slavery, she cannot remember her mother's face. Sold away years ago, her wrists bear faint scars from shackles once tighter. Every morning she polishes the silver cups her master drinks from. Every evening, when he dines, she stands behind him like his shadow. Outside, her master's guests discuss politics and conquest, their words heavy with victory. They call it Pax Romana, the Roman peace. To Tullia, peace means quiet submission, no words, no dreams, just survival. Yet behind her tired eyes flickers something. Not rebellion, not yet. Something smaller, more dangerous. Memory. She remembers the songs her mother whispered in a foreign tongue, the rhythm of freedom. For Rome's slaves, to remember was an act of courage, to hope was an act of rebellion. The psychology of domination. What kept millions from rising up? Not just the sword, but the mind. The Romans practiced what we would now call psychological warfare. They used ceremony, humiliation, and propaganda to remind slaves of their natural place. On Saturnalia, a festival of inversion, slaves were allowed to mock their masters for a single day, before being reminded in every hour thereafter how fixed the world truly was. Rome taught domination not only through pain, but through ritual. The master demanded not only labor, but loyalty. A good slave in Roman eyes was one who believed the system righteous. And so many did, enough at least to keep the empire's heart beating. Even language served control. The word servus meant slave, but it also came to mean servant, worker, anyone subordinate. Freedom itself was defined by what it was not enslaved. The Romans could not imagine a world without slaves because the empire itself was structured to depend on them. Blood, bread, and entertainment. In Rome's grand amphitheatres, crowds roared as gladiators fought for survival. Many were slaves, war captives turned into spectacles of death. The crowd's cheers were more than entertainment. They were a declaration of supremacy, the free watching the enslaved die for their pleasure. For the elite, such violence was proof of divine order. For the enslaved, it was both warning and promise. Some became heroes in death, symbols of courage that flickered for an instant before being extinguished. Beneath the sand, the empire's secret bled through. Rome was addicted to control, and its addiction required suffering. A world built on fear. Across the empire, the pattern repeated. A family near Carthage, torn apart at auction. A farmer in Hispania, forced to labor until his hands became nothing but callous tools. A child in Sicily, branded for trying to run away. Records carved in stone tell the cold arithmetic of this cruelty. Millions enslaved, generations erased. The empire called it efficiency. Historians later called it civilization. But in truth, the Roman miracle was this: an entire world organized by brutality. The great marble streets, the aqueducts, the wealth of the empire, all financed by what one historian called the silent labor of invisible hands. Rome's greatness did not rise despite its cruelty. It rose because of it. The whisper of rebellion. And yet, not all voices were silent. In the mountains of southern Italy, whispers spread of a Thracian gladiator, a slave who would refuse to die quietly. His name, at first, meant nothing to Rome. But his defiance would soon ignite the largest slave uprising the world had ever seen. Before his name turned to legend, before the sound of his rebellion reached the walls of Rome, he was just another captive who had seen what no man could forget: how easily Rome crushed those who dared dream of freedom. He watched a man crucified for stealing bread. He heard the laughter of soldiers echo off the stones, and slowly, in his heart, something began to burn. The morning mist hung heavy over Capua. The air smelled of rain and iron. Beyond the city's walls, the amphitheatre loomed, a hungry mouth carved of stone. Within its shadow, hundreds of gladiators stirred awake in the training barracks. They were soldiers of spectacle, slaves trained not simply to fight, but to die well. Among them stood a man whose silence made others uneasy. Broad-shouldered, with eyes like burnt amber, he spoke little of his past. The trainer called him Spartacus. To most, he was just another Thracian captive, a man whose strength might one day feed the crowd's roar. But those closest to him sensed something different. Beneath his calm was a simmering rage older than Rome itself. Each morning began the same: the clang of chains, the bark of commands, wooden swords thrust against straw men until arms trembled. Pain was the teacher, obedience the goal. Over them all towered the Lannister, the master of the gladiators, a man who knew when to feed and when to beat his stock. Rome's obsession with violence had found its perfect expression in this place. The amphitheatre was a factory of death, where every scream became a form of profit. Blood was entertainment. A well-fought killing could mean survival, hesitation meant death. The crowd demanded spectacle, and the empire delivered it with efficiency and pride. Chains and brotherhood. That night, after hours of training and punishment, the men ate in silence. Gruel, bread, water. Slaves from different lands sat beside one another. Gauls, Germans, Greeks, Africans, Syrians. They had been enemies once. Now they were bound by the same iron fate. A Gaul with a scar across his face muttered, "We die tomorrow for their laughter, but what if they had no show?" The room went still. No one dared answer. Even the walls seemed to listen. Spartacus said nothing then, but his hand gripped the cup so tightly it cracked. In Rome's logic, fear divided the enslaved. Different tongues, different gods, no unity, no danger. Yet here in the dim light, something began to form, a fragile idea that they might not be alone. Rome's stage of death. Days later, the gates of the amphitheatre opened. The roar hit like thunder. Dust and sun filled the air. Spartacus stood with 10 others in the staging pen, waiting for the signal. His chest was bare, the mark of a slave burned on his arm. Above, noblemen reclined on cushioned seats, eyes bright with greed. Each man's death was their recreation, each agony their entertainment. When the signal came, a blare of horns. The gates rose. The sand gleamed like gold. 2 men stumbled forward and killed for survival. The crowd howled. The smell of blood drifted upward, mixing with perfume. Spartacus watched it all, not as a frightened man, but as one awakening. How could one city find joy in such cruelty? How could human life be turned into theatre? When his turn came, he fought fiercely, instinct guiding every move. A Roman net fighter lunged. Spartacus twisted, grabbed the man's arm and turned his weapon against him. A quick strike, and the match was done. The crowd exploded with cheers. They loved him. For now. But when the Lannister approached later, praising his skill while tightening the chains on his wrists, Spartacus understood the futility of their admiration. He was still property. He was still a tool. The arena gave glory, but only to those who could never claim it. The machinery of control. Outside the amphitheatres, the empire's cruelty ran as deep as its wealth. In city alleys, slaves carried their masters through the streets, their feet bleeding from the stones. On farms, men toiled under the eyes of overseers wielding nooses and brands. In households, women endured the night's silence and a master's hand they could not refuse. Rome saw itself as civilized, but its civilization was a cage gilded with rhetoric. Even philosophers defended slavery as a natural condition. Seneca claimed kindness to a slave was noble, but not equality. Aristotle's ghost still whispered through Rome, "Some are born to rule, others to serve." Rome's law was the law of mastery. Freedom came from power, and power came from violence. Yet in its hunger for control, the empire built an endless contradiction, one that would soon ignite into open flame. Seeds of rebellion. Months passed. The barracks grew restless. Talk spread quietly, rumors of disobedience, of escape. Each whisper risked torture. Each secret word was spoken with bated breath. One night, during a storm that rattled the gates, Spartacus spoke for the first time against fear. "They think our chains make us weak," he said, voice low but steady. "But what if our chains make us strong? What if the same iron that binds us could strike back?" A silence followed. The men stared. Then, almost imperceptibly, heads nodded. Freedom was no longer a dream. It was an idea too powerful to vanish, and like all forbidden ideas, it began to spread faster than Rome could contain it. The turning point. A plan formed in shadows. They would rise at dawn during the next delivery of weapons, about 70 men in all. The odds were hopeless, but hope was a new thing they had learned to wield. The morning came, the guards opened the armory gates, and chaos erupted. Blades flashed, chains snapped. The first Roman fell before he could shout for help. Others tried to resist, only to meet the fury of men with nothing left to lose. The air filled with screams and the clash of metal. Within an hour, the barracks burned. Smoke rose like a signal into the sky. From the flames, Spartacus emerged, leading a force of freed men, barefoot, wounded, alive. Behind him stretched a growing tide, gladiators who had broken the unbreakable. That day, Rome awoke to an unthinkable realization. Its own instruments of entertainment had turned into its executioners. And as Spartacus raised a stolen sword toward the horizon, the volcano that was Roman slavery began to rumble beneath the empire's marble foundations. The Republic would soon tremble not from foreign invaders, but from the fury of those it thought could never rise. The smoke from Capua rose like a signal fire across the Italian plains. Word spread faster than legions could march. The gladiators had revolted. For generations, slaves had suffered in silence. Now, for the first time in memory, they had struck back. The countryside trembled with rumor. Travelers whispered of battles fought with kitchen knives, of slaves killing masters in the night, of whole estates set ablaze. To the Roman elite, such rumors were nightmares. But to the enslaved, they were a heartbeat, a sign that the impossible might be happening. The birth of an army. After their victory in Capua, Spartacus and his men fled south toward Mount Vesuvius. The slopes of the volcano became their refuge, a natural fortress, steep and hard to reach. There, surrounded by ash and forest, a new kind of army began to form. At first it was chaos. Gladiators knew how to fight, not how to lead. They had no discipline, no supplies, no plan beyond survival. But Spartacus was different. He spoke to them not as a master, but as an equal. He taught them to believe that they were no longer slaves. They were soldiers of a new cause, vengeance. He organized camps, divided men by skill, and sent scouts into the countryside for food and weapons. Each day more slaves joined them, field hands, miners, shepherds, and women carrying children in their arms. Their eyes carried the same hollow tiredness, but their steps grew steadier once they entered the camp. By the end of the first month, thousands stood beneath his command. What had begun as an uprising was turning into a movement, a rebellion Rome could not ignore. Rome reacts. The Senate was stunned. To them, the idea of slaves defeating free men was almost unthinkable. They dismissed the revolt as a bandit raid, sending a small militia under the command of Gaius Claudius Glaber. Glaber's task was simple: surround the slaves on Vesuvius and starve them into submission. But Spartacus refused to wait for death. As Roman soldiers blocked the mountain's paths, Spartacus studied the terrain. He noticed the thick vines that hung down the steep cliffs. That night, under cover of darkness, he and his men cut those vines, twisted them into ropes, and descended silently down the mountain's hidden side. The next morning, the Romans awoke to silence, then chaos. Spartacus's army had circled behind them, attacking from the rear with stolen weapons and the raw fury of the abused. The Roman camp collapsed within hours. Hundreds lay dead, the rest fled north in panic. The impossible had happened. A slave army had defeated Rome's soldiers. The fire spreads. The victory sent shockwaves through Italy. From Sicily to Etruria, enslaved people abandoned their masters and fled to join Spartacus. Entire plantations stood empty overnight. Rome's wealth, its farms, its households, its mines, was built on slave labor. Now that foundation was cracking. To the free poor, the revolt offered another kind of hope. Many had lost their land to Roman expansion and now lived as beggars. Some joined the rebels, not for justice, but for survival. In Spartacus's camp, they found both food and purpose. Rome's elite, meanwhile, began to panic. If slaves and peasants united, the empire itself could fracture. Senators argued fiercely in the Curia, blaming each other for underestimating the uprising. The fear was no longer just military, it was moral. If slaves were capable of such courage, what did that say about Rome's soul? The War of Retribution. More Roman armies came, stronger, larger, disciplined. Spartacus met them all with cunning. He knew he could never defeat Rome in open battle, so he used the land itself as a weapon. His troops struck fast and vanished into hills and forests. They ambushed supply caravans, freed prisoners and burned roads behind them. To the Romans, this was shameful warfare. To Spartacus, it was survival. Over time, he grew not only as a fighter, but as a leader. He forbade killing civilians. He insisted that women and children travel safely behind the front lines. "We fight," he said, "not to become what they are, but to break what they have made of us." His men began to see him not as a man, but as a symbol, a living challenge to everything Rome believed about power. The hope of freedom. Historians later disagreed on what Spartacus truly wanted. Some said he sought to march north and escape Italy altogether, freeing his men to return to their homelands. Others believed he dreamed of turning Rome's own order upside down, to build a world where no master stood above another human being. Perhaps the truth lay somewhere between. The sources tell us that Spartacus tried to lead his army over the Alps twice, but many refused to leave. Freedom and vengeance had become inseparable. They could not imagine peace while Rome still stood unpunished behind them. The rebellion had given them identity, dignity, and a vision of power they had never known. To walk away now felt like betraying the dead who had lifted them this far. The face of fear. In Rome, fear turned to fury. The Senate called in men of ruthless efficiency, veterans of many wars. This was no longer a nuisance, it was a civil war. The most powerful republic in the world was at war with its own slaves. Rich citizens fled the countryside, leaving behind scorched estates. Whole towns locked their gates. Every corner of Italy became a battlefield, and in every captured slave, the Romans saw not just an enemy, but a reflection of their own cruelty. In the Senate halls, one question burned. How long could Rome survive if its peace rested on terror? The march north. Spartacus decided to move northward again toward the Alps. His army had grown to over 70,000. They carried weapons taken from dead Romans, shields made from plough blades, hope made from ashes. Behind them, villages smouldered. Ahead, the snow-tipped mountains shone, a promise of escape. But within the ranks, not all agreed. Some commanders, like the Gaul Crixus, wanted to stay and fight. They dreamed not of escape, but of revenge, of storming the cities that had enslaved them. Spartacus warned that such pride would destroy them. Yet he could not command all hearts. The rebellion was free, but its freedom carried chaos. Inevitably, the army splintered. Crixus took his followers south to meet the legions head-on. Spartacus marched north. When news came that Crixus and his men had been massacred, Spartacus stopped his advance. He ordered the Romans taken prisoner to fight in ritual games of his own, mock battles to honor the dead. But unlike the Roman games, he did not kill them for pleasure. He forced the Romans to feel what they had once demanded of others. The message was clear. The age of Roman mercy had ended. The slaves had learned cruelty from their masters, and now Rome would taste its own medicine. A storm gathering. By now, Rome's patience had shattered. More legions were called back from foreign wars. Command was given to Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in the empire, a man known both for ambition and merciless discipline. Crassus swore Rome would not be shamed again. Meanwhile, Spartacus's forces moved like ghosts through Italy, attacking from nowhere, vanishing into mountains. But exhaustion was setting in. Supplies were scarce, winter stalked them, and still the Alps remained distant. In those long nights, fires flickered in the cold. Soldiers huddled beneath cloaks, whispering of home, of what freedom would mean. Some dreamed of return, others feared the journey itself, and Spartacus, alone beside the embers, felt the growing weight of a dream turning to destiny. He had united the broken. He had challenged the greatest power on earth. But could he truly rebuild the world, or was he only lighting one bright, doomed flame in the endless darkness of empire? At dawn, he looked toward the north. The snow glowed red in the rising sun, a promise or a warning. No one could yet tell. The winter wind tore across the plains as Spartacus's army moved north, its once mighty ranks now thinner, colder, hungrier. The dream of freedom had carried them far, but dreams do not feed men or sharpen their blades. For months they had marched through ruin. Fields stripped bare, villages burned by Roman patrols. The land itself seemed to turn against them. Still, they pressed on. Freedom was no longer an idea in their minds. It was the only thing keeping them alive. Crassus and the iron discipline. In Rome, Crassus gathered an army unlike any that had come before. 8 legions, hardened veterans from past wars. Each soldier was a citizen of the Republic, trained not just in battle, but in obedience. Crassus knew that Rome's pride had been stained by defeat after defeat. He would wash that stain away in slave blood. The first thing Crassus did was restore fear among his own men. When one of his legions fled during an engagement, he revived a punishment Rome had long abandoned: decimation. Every 10th man was executed by his comrades. The message was simple. Rome's army would fear Crassus more than they feared the enemy. This was the brutality that built empires, not the rage of the chaotic, but the cold efficiency of the disciplined. Rome had learnt to weaponize cruelty, and now Crassus would use it to reclaim control. The trap in the south. Spartacus realized too late that the mountains were impossible to cross. The Alpine passes were blocked by snow and Roman patrols. Turning back, he resolved to march south again, toward the sea. There he hoped to secure ships from pirates who had promised to carry his forces away to freedom. For a time, hope flickered again. If they could reach Sicily, they might spark uprisings there, where slaves had rebelled before. But ambition met betrayal. The pirates took the payment, gold and plundered treasure, and vanished into the horizon. Spartacus was left stranded on the shore, his army trapped between the sea and Crassus's advancing legions. What followed was not a battle, but a slow tightening of chains. Crassus ordered trenches and walls, miles of them, built across southern Italy, cutting the rebels off from escape. Men who had once torn iron gates from their hinges now found themselves caged by Rome's precision. Inside the enclosure, food ran low, disease spread, hope thinned. The same men who had once defied fear now faced hunger's quiet cruelty. Some called for surrender, others swore to die fighting. Spartacus said nothing for a long time. Then, one night, under a weeping sky, he spoke. "If Rome must chain us again," he said softly, "let them chain our corpses, not our souls." The final march. In the last phase of the war, desperation turned to fire. Spartacus led a daring assault, breaking through a section of Crassus's fortifications. Thousands escaped the trap, pushing north one final time. But this army was not what it once had been. Discipline had frayed, weapons were scarce, and exhaustion clung to every step. Crassus pursued relentlessly. Meanwhile, another Roman general, Pompey, was returning from campaigns in Spain with fresh troops. Rome, now united by the taste of victory, closed its jaws on the rebellion. Spartacus knew what awaited them, yet even in ruin he refused to run. He gathered his men and spoke of what they had done, how they had turned fear itself into fire, how for a brief heartbeat of history, slaves had fought Rome and lived. "No man can promise you freedom," he told them. "We take it, or we die proving we were worthy of it." The last stand. The final battle came on a plain near the river Silarus. The dawn was blood-red, the air thick with the smell of rain and death. Spartacus stood on a small rise, sword in hand, no armor on his body, only resolve in his eyes. Around him, the remnants of his army waited, thousands against tens of thousands. When the Roman horn sounded, Spartacus charged first. He cut through lines like a storm through grain, driving straight toward Crassus himself. Ancient writers said he killed 2 centurions on his way, and when his horse was wounded he dismounted to fight on foot, crying that fortune had taken his means of flight. They said he fought until his men fell around him, until he vanished beneath a wall of Roman shields. His body was never found. Only the silence afterward told the story. The rebellion was crushed. Those who survived, over 6,000, were captured and crucified along the Appian Way. For miles, crucifixes lined the road between Capua and Rome. Travelers would cover their faces as they passed, for the stench of decay carried for weeks. Rome called it a warning, but those who truly looked saw something else, an entire nation of the enslaved staring back, their dying eyes unbroken. The price of order. The Senate hailed Crassus as savior, and Pompey claimed the credit for finishing the remnants. Festivals celebrated their victory. The city that had trembled at the thought of rebellion now returned to its games, its banquets, its trade in flesh. But though the roads were cleared, something in Rome's heart had changed. For the first time, its citizens had seen the truth behind their peace. The fields that fed them, the villas that comforted them, the streets that dazzled visitors, all were soaked in the sweat and blood of those they called less than human. They would never free the millions still in chains, not yet. But something had cracked in the empire's illusion of perfection. The revolt of Spartacus was not the end of slavery, it was the beginning of doubt. The legacy of fire. Years later, Roman writers tried to erase the shame. They wrote of Spartacus as a bandit, a brute, a man who sought chaos. But they could not erase the awe that lingered in his name. Generals studied his tactics, philosophers pondered his courage. The poor whispered of him as a ghost of freedom. Rome would rule for centuries more. Its legions would march, its slaves would toil, and its cruelty would continue. But in every generation someone would remember the fire that once lit the Italian plains, the fire started by a man who dared to ask the most dangerous question of all. What happens when those who are broken no longer obey? That question would echo long after Rome's walls had crumbled. long after its statues had turned to dust. The empire's roads would fade, but the story of its chains, the story of how brutality tried to hold a world together, would never die. And in every age that followed, in every land where the powerful ground the weak beneath their boots, the whisper of Spartacus would rise again, reminding the masters of men that no chain lasts forever. The wind that once carried Rome's banners now moves through ruins. The Appian Way, where 6,000 crucified bodies hung in warning, has long turned to dust. Yet the echo of that road and the empire it served still shapes the world. The story of Rome's power is the story of domination itself, how cruelty became a system and how that system blinded an entire civilization to its own decay. Rome after the rebellion. In the years that followed Spartacus's fall, Rome learned nothing of mercy. It doubled down on fear. Slave markets grew larger, more organized. Every new conquest, Gaul, Egypt, Parthia, brought new human cargo. Every victory fed the same machine that had once been threatened by rebellion. The plantations of southern Italy became vast fields worked by chained men. Overseers carried whips of knotted leather, their tips stained from countless blows. Mines in Spain swallowed thousands more, their lungs filled with black dust long before freedom could ever reach them. In the capital, noblemen boasted of their estates, their banquets, their marble halls, a beauty bought with agony. Rome's poets sang of peace. Its generals marched under banners of civilization. But beneath those words lay the hum of hidden suffering. For every Roman citizen who slept under a roof, 10 slaves shivered beneath one they built. For every politician who spoke of order, countless lives were spent keeping that illusion intact. Rome had defeated Spartacus, but it had not silenced what he revealed. That its greatness was a prison for millions. The machinery of fear. Slavery in Rome was not only an economic system, it was a philosophy. The empire taught that power was the same as right. The rich were not just wealthier, they were believed to be more virtuous, closer to the gods. The poor and enslaved were told they were born to serve and that submission was their duty to the divine order. The Romans believed this deeply. It allowed them to build cruelty into the very bones of their society, between classes, between families, between nations. The master's command became sacred, the slave's obedience became holy. In that belief, Rome found both its unity and its doom. For the few who questioned it, the price was exile or death. Philosophers who spoke of equality whispered in secret. Some Stoics argued that virtue could live in the heart of a slave as well as a senator, but by then Rome no longer wanted to hear inconvenient truths. The empire had grown too large, too proud, to see past its own walls. And yet, those walls were already cracking. The slowly breaking empire. Centuries passed. The power that had once ruled 3 continents began to rot from within. Corruption spread in the Senate. Armies turned on their own generals. Plagues and famine devoured the countryside. The same iron discipline that had held the empire together now crushed it from the inside. As wealth flooded to the elite, Rome's heart hollowed. Its citizens grew soft, while its slaves carried the weight of an entire world. And when the barbarian tribes came from the north, tearing through its defenses, the empire discovered that fear could only rule as long as people believed in it. What had been held together by pain could not withstand collapse. The empire of chains began to crumble under its own weight. But the idea of Rome, its methods, its hierarchy, its logic of domination, did not perish. Like a shadow, it passed into the hands of those who came after. The echo of chains. Long after the Tiber ran silent with ashes, humanity repeated Rome's pattern. In the cotton fields of the American South, in the sugar islands of the Caribbean, in the diamond pits of Africa, the same justifications reappeared. New words for an old cruelty. Empire after empire wrapped its whips in language of civilization, progress, order. They borrowed Rome's tools and Rome's pride, never realizing they were inheriting Rome's sickness. The architecture of oppression remained, the markets, the blood, the silence. When men in later centuries studied the ruins of the Colosseum, they marveled at its grandeur. Few paused to count the bones buried beneath it. But every now and then, among the oppressed, the forgotten, the broken, something of Spartacus's defiance stirred again. In every uprising, in every whisper of revolt, in every cry for justice, a spark of that old rebellion lived on. A lesson for the living. History remembers Rome as the master of the world, but its true legacy lies not in marble or conquest, it lies in the question it left behind. How long can power last when it is built on the suffering of others? Every empire that came after Rome has faced some version of this question, and every one that ignored it has eventually fallen. Because no wall, no law, no army can erase the hunger for freedom. The human spirit does not stay chained forever. In that way, Spartacus did not lose. He showed the world a truth Rome could never bury, that no civilization built on cruelty can forever escape the judgment of those it crushed. The Roman Empire vanished, but the battle it began, the struggle between those who command and those who endure, still shapes our era. Its echoes live in boardrooms and prisons, in labor camps and corporate towers, wherever power justifies itself through fear. History moves like a tide. Each generation chooses whether to repeat Rome's lesson or to break it. And so, the story ends where it began, on a world built of chains. The question remains, waiting for each of us to answer in our own time. When fear rules and cruelty thrives, who will be brave enough to rise again?